The birth of Britain's overseas colonies. By the beginning of the 17th century, England had moved beyond simply exploring distant coastlines. Its merchants had proven that overseas trade could generate enormous wealth, while political leaders recognized that permanent settlements offered strategic advantages that temporary expeditions never could. Across Europe, competition for influence was becoming increasingly fierce, and England knew that if it wanted a place among the world's great powers, it would have to establish colonies of its own. The first attempts were anything but easy. Crossing the Atlantic remained an extraordinary challenge. A single voyage could take several months, and storms frequently scattered ships across the ocean. Disease spread quickly in the cramped conditions below deck. Fresh water often became contaminated, and food supplies spoiled long before the journey ended. For many settlers, simply reaching the New World alive was considered a victory. Those who survived the voyage faced an even greater struggle. Most settlements were established along unfamiliar coastlines where colonists knew little about the climate, local wildlife, or growing seasons. Crops failed, harsh winters claimed countless lives, and shortages of food became a recurring problem. Entire communities sometimes depended on supply ships arriving from England, but bad weather or war could delay those vessels for months. Despite these hardships, England refused to abandon its colonial ambitions. One of the earliest successful settlements was founded along the Atlantic coast of North America in the early 1600s. Unlike previous expeditions that focused mainly on exploration, this colony was designed to become a permanent English community. Investors hoped it would produce valuable exports, while the Crown viewed it as a strategic foothold against rival European powers. Life there was difficult from the very beginning. Many settlers arrived expecting to discover gold rather than build farms or construct homes. As a result, food production received little attention during the colony's first years. Hunger, disease, and internal disputes nearly destroyed the settlement before stronger leadership and improved organization allowed it to survive. Meanwhile, another type of colony began taking shape farther north. Groups seeking greater religious freedom crossed the Atlantic, hoping to establish communities where they could govern themselves according to their own beliefs. These settlers viewed their colonies not simply as commercial enterprises, but as opportunities to build entirely new societies. Families, rather than fortune seekers, became the foundation of these settlements, allowing towns and villages to develop more steadily over time. As new colonies expanded, England developed different methods of governing them. Some were administered directly by officials appointed by the Crown. Others operated under royal charters that granted colonists significant local authority. Certain settlements were controlled by wealthy proprietors who received large land grants in exchange for financing colonial development. This flexible approach allowed England to establish colonies rapidly without relying entirely on the royal government. Economic opportunity attracted people from many different backgrounds. Farmers searched for fertile land unavailable at home. Craftsmen hoped to build successful businesses. Merchants looked for profitable trading opportunities. Religious minorities sought freedom from persecution. Even convicted criminals were sometimes transported overseas to ease overcrowded prisons while providing much-needed labor for developing settlements. Agriculture quickly became the backbone of colonial life. In the southern colonies, tobacco emerged as one of the most profitable cash crops. European demand grew rapidly, creating fortunes for plantation owners while encouraging continuous expansion inland. Large estates required an enormous workforce, initially supplied through indentured servants who agreed to work for several years in exchange for passage across the Atlantic. Over time, however, colonial labor systems changed dramatically. As plantation agriculture expanded throughout North America and the Caribbean, demand for workers increased beyond what voluntary migration could provide. European merchants became deeply involved in the Atlantic slave trade, transporting millions of enslaved Africans across the ocean under horrific conditions. Human beings were treated as property, bought and sold to work on plantations producing sugar, tobacco, cotton, and other valuable commodities. The wealth generated by this system flowed into ports throughout the British Isles, helping finance shipbuilding, manufacturing, banking, and commercial expansion. At the same time, it created one of the darkest chapters in British imperial history, leaving consequences that would continue long after slavery itself was abolished. While North America expanded, England also strengthened its position in the Caribbean. Although many Caribbean islands were relatively small, they proved immensely profitable due to sugar cultivation. During the 17th century, sugar became one of Europe's most valuable luxury goods, generating extraordinary wealth for plantation owners and merchants alike. Competition for these islands was intense. English, French, Dutch, and Spanish fleets repeatedly fought for control of strategic ports and plantations. Some islands changed hands multiple times through wars and treaties, reflecting their enormous economic importance. Across the Atlantic, England's commercial interests continued to grow in Africa and Asia. Rather than establishing large colonies immediately, English merchants built fortified trading posts along important coastlines. These outposts served as centers for commerce, allowing ships to resupply while expanding trade in spices, textiles, ivory, precious metals, and countless other goods. One organization gradually became especially influential. The East India Company, originally founded as a commercial enterprise, established trading stations across the Indian Ocean. At first, its representatives negotiated with local rulers primarily to secure favorable trading agreements. However, increasing competition with other European powers soon encouraged the company to protect its interests through military force. Private armies were recruited, fortifications were expanded. Commercial disputes increasingly evolved into political conflicts. Without intending to create an empire, the company slowly became involved in governing territory, collecting taxes, and influencing regional politics. Back in Europe, England itself was undergoing major political transformation. Civil war, changing monarchs, and constitutional struggles reshaped the balance of power between Parliament and the Crown. Yet despite domestic instability, overseas expansion continued almost uninterrupted. Merchants recognized that colonial trade remained one of the country's greatest sources of wealth, and successive governments supported further expansion regardless of political differences. By the late 17th century, England possessed colonies stretching across the Atlantic, thriving commercial networks reaching into Africa and Asia, and an increasingly powerful navy capable of protecting those interests. The nation's economy had become deeply connected to overseas commerce. Ships carried manufactured goods from England to Africa. Enslaved people were transported across the Atlantic. Colonial products returned to Europe. This interconnected system linked 3 continents in a vast commercial network that generated immense profits while also causing immeasurable human suffering. England was no longer simply a European kingdom. It had become a growing maritime power whose future depended increasingly on distant lands across the world's oceans. The age of exploration was coming to an end. The age of empire had truly begun, the creation of Great Britain and the rise of a global power. As the 17th century drew to a close, England had established a growing network of colonies stretching across the Atlantic Ocean. Trade was expanding rapidly, merchants were accumulating enormous fortunes, and the Royal Navy was becoming one of Europe's most capable maritime forces. Yet, despite these achievements, one major obstacle remained much closer to home. The island of Great Britain was still divided. England and Scotland shared the same monarch after the union of the crowns in 1603, but each kingdom maintained its own parliament, legal system, and financial institutions. While cooperation existed, political disagreements and economic rivalry frequently complicated relations between the two nations. Scotland, in particular, faced significant challenges. Its economy was much smaller than England's, and many Scottish merchants watched with frustration as English colonial trade generated increasing wealth. English laws restricted Scottish access to overseas markets, preventing them from participating fully in the rapidly expanding Atlantic economy. Determined to change their fortunes, Scottish investors launched an ambitious colonial venture during the late 17th century. Their goal was bold. They planned to establish a settlement on the narrow strip of land connecting North and South America, hoping to control trade moving between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. If successful, the colony could transform Scotland into one of Europe's leading commercial powers. The project attracted extraordinary public support. Merchants, landowners, and ordinary citizens invested large portions of their savings, believing that the expedition would secure Scotland's economic future. Reality proved far different. The settlers encountered relentless tropical diseases, poor harvests, unfamiliar conditions, and growing hostility from nearby Spanish authorities who considered the region part of their own empire. Isolated from reliable supplies and weakened by illness, the colony collapsed within only a few years. The financial consequences were devastating. Many of Scotland's wealthiest investors lost everything, and confidence in the country's independent economic future was badly shaken. At the same time, England's overseas trade continued to flourish, highlighting the growing gap between the two neighboring kingdoms. Political leaders on both sides increasingly believed that closer cooperation offered significant advantages. For England, union would strengthen security by preventing Scotland from aligning with rival European powers. For Scotland, access to England's colonial markets promised new opportunities for trade, investment, and economic recovery. After years of negotiation, both parliaments approved the Acts of Union in 1707. England and Scotland formally united to create the Kingdom of Great Britain. The separate Scottish Parliament was dissolved, with representatives instead taking seats in the Parliament at Westminster. Although Scotland retained its own legal system, education, and church, the two nations now operated under a single government, creating a more unified political and economic state. The impact of union was immediate. Scottish merchants gained access to England's colonial trading networks. Scottish soldiers entered the expanding British Army. Scottish engineers, doctors, merchants, and administrators began playing major roles throughout Britain's overseas possessions. The empire that emerged during the 18th century would become not simply an English empire, but a British one. The timing could hardly have been better. Europe soon entered another period of almost continuous warfare, with Britain's rivals including France, Spain, and the Dutch Republic competing for influence across the globe. Unlike earlier conflicts that had been fought mainly in Europe, these wars increasingly extended to North America, the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia. Colonies became valuable prizes. Control of important ports, fertile islands, and strategic trade routes often mattered as much as victories on European battlefields. Britain's growing naval strength gave it a decisive advantage. The Royal Navy expanded rapidly, protecting merchant convoys while disrupting enemy shipping. New dockyards, increased ship production, and advances in navigation allowed British fleets to operate farther from home than ever before. The oceans gradually became Britain's greatest weapon. Rather than maintaining enormous standing armies like many continental powers, Britain relied on maritime superiority to defend its interests and weaken its enemies. Merchant vessels carried wealth across the globe, while naval squadrons ensured those routes remained open even during wartime. Trade flourished alongside military expansion. British manufactured goods found eager markets overseas, while raw materials flowed back into factories at home. Sugar from the Caribbean, tobacco from North America, tea from Asia, timber from Canada, and countless other products fueled economic growth throughout the kingdom. London evolved into one of the world's busiest commercial centers. Banks developed new financial instruments that made international trade more efficient. Marine insurance reduced the risks associated with long-distance voyages, encouraging even greater investment. The London Stock Exchange became an increasingly important institution, connecting investors with commercial ventures around the globe. These financial innovations gave Britain advantages that extended well beyond military power. Merchants could raise enormous amounts of capital for overseas enterprises. Governments could finance expensive wars through public borrowing. Private companies could fund exploration, trade, and colonial expansion on a scale few rivals could match. At the same time, Britain's influence in India continued to grow. Initially established as trading settlements along the coast, British commercial outposts became increasingly involved in regional politics. Rival European powers supported competing local rulers, turning commercial competition into military confrontation. Small company armies gradually expanded. Fortifications became stronger. Trading posts evolved into administrative centers. Although the British government exercised limited direct control over these developments, events in India would soon transform Britain's global position. Meanwhile, Britain's North American colonies continued expanding westward. Growing populations established new towns, farms, and ports along the Atlantic coastline. Immigration from England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and other parts of Europe increased steadily, creating some of the fastest-growing settlements in the world. Yet expansion also created tension. As colonists moved into new territories, conflicts with indigenous nations became more frequent. Different alliances emerged, often influenced by the broader rivalry between Britain and France. Native communities found themselves caught between competing European empires, each seeking local allies while pursuing their own strategic goals. By the middle of the 18th century, Britain stood on the edge of becoming the world's dominant imperial power. Its economy was expanding rapidly. Its navy controlled vital sea lanes. Its colonies stretched across multiple continents. Its merchants traded in nearly every major port. Its financial institutions funded ventures on an unprecedented scale. What had begun as scattered settlements and trading companies was evolving into a vast interconnected empire. The next great conflict would determine whether Britain could transform that growing network into the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. The stage was set for a global struggle that would reshape the balance of power forever.